Good afternoon, everybody. It's wonderful to be with you this afternoon. And I'm Nikki Bush, human potential and parenting expert, mother of two boys. In fact, just the other side of being teenagers. So I have just celebrated my youngest son's 21st birthday. So I'm bringing a perspective from the other side of the teen. So been there, done that, got the t-shirt. And I'm joined today by my co-presenters, Savannah Seafor, who is a transformational trainer, highly experienced, and we have her daughter Lola, who is 16 years old and is going to share her thoughts and her mind with you. I'm sure you've always wondered what teenagers think. So today you get a window into a teenager's mind.
Hi, everybody. It's really lovely to be here. We're thrilled to be joining you today. As Nikki said, I'm with Lola, who's my 16-year-old daughter, and I have a 13-year-old daughter. So I am fully on the teenage roller coaster with many of you who are here today. If you'd like to pop into the chat what teens you have, what gender they are, how old they are, and that might be able to help us to focus some of the info and answer some of your questions later on. If you have any questions, you're welcome to pop those into the chat throughout the session, and we'll get to them as and when we can. We do have some time set aside for questions at the end, but as we go along, you're more than welcome to pop them in there, and we'll get to them later on. And I think back to you, Nikki.
Obviously, different ages and stages bring up different stuff for parents and for children. And with teens, we're now in that age of risk and experimentation. So it's a very, very different place to where you were when your children were in primary school, preteen, when they were still compliant and they were learning how to be in the world according to your rules. And now we're watching a butterfly creep out of that chrysalis, and we need to be helping our teen to find their own voice. And it may be a little different to yours, which is often quite a shock to parents. And the space between children and their parents in this teenage phase is very different, and our expectations have to change with the times. So I'm going to throw this open to Lola, because she's going to share with us throughout the course of the next hour and a half some of her do's and don'ts for parents who are raising teens. So Lola, over to you.
Thank you so much. So when my mom and Nikki asked me to do this, they asked me to write down a whole bunch of do's and don'ts for parents of teens. And so enjoy. So my first one is do be mindful of language. Instead of using words like don't or you mustn't, use words like rather, because that makes space for mistakes. Do clarify what you are saying, because you might say something and know what you mean, but we might be on a completely different page. And do listen and let us finish. Be fully engaged and let us have your undivided attention for just the time that we need you.
Mm. And I think that's such a huge one. And I think, one of the most important things that I've experienced as a mom of teens is how absolutely crucial it is to have good communication channels. I think that when our children are smaller, there's a lot more of just, telling them what to do. And there's not really pushback or why must I do that? Or, as you said, Nikki, they are a lot more compliant. And we're moving from compliance now into independence. And in order for us to stay connected, communication during this time and finding ways to connect and communicate workably with your teen are absolutely paramount. So this point, especially of Lola's, which is please listen and be engaged and let us finish what we're saying, is a huge one. And I find that especially now with so many people working from home, I think our partial attention is terrible. And so the challenge really is when you're having a chat with your teen to close your computer, to flip your phone over or have it in another room, because this undivided attention is so important. I was actually reading an interesting article this week that said the most important skill for the upcoming decades is going to be the ability to pay attention, because it's almost an art that we've lost. And so I think, the first thing for me in terms of communication is modeling good communication. It's teaching your children how to communicate. This is not something they learn at school, unfortunately.
Yeah. And also, we all make mistakes and we have to learn from our mistakes. I had such an interesting lesson in communication and listening from my eldest son. When he got his driver's license, his learner's license, it was a wonderful thing because I'd always wanted to have a chauffeur. Every mother gets exhausted from running her children around, or dad, whoever's doing the running. It really is exhausting sometimes. And I'd always wanted a chauffeur so that when I was with my kids in the car, I could have quality time, because then I could sit in the car and chat to them and not have to focus on the road, and we could have lunch. I had this lovely dream. And if they weren't in the car, then I could work while the chauffeur drove and not waste my time in the traffic. So anyway, my son gets his learner's license and I pick him up from school. And of course, what happens when your son gets a learner's license, or your child gets a learner's license, is that you swap seats. So I get into the passenger seat, Ryan gets into the driver's seat, and off we go. And we chatting away, and he's telling me all about his day at school. Now, I had actually been trying to get hold of my sister earlier in the day, and she's a teacher. And, teachers can't actually answer their phones during school, so I'd left a message. And I urgently needed to speak to her, but I didn't preface my conversation with my son with, if your aunt phones me, I'm going to take the call. So we're in mid-conversation, and aunt phones, my sister phones, and I say to my son, just hold on, just hold it there. I need to take this call. And I took a 5-minute call with my sister. When the conversation ended, I turned back to my son in the driver's seat and I said, so where were we? And he said, conversation over. And he was actually just telling me that I'd been jolly rude. I hadn't had good enough etiquette to warn him that she might phone, and I'd cut him dead with no warning whatsoever, and I had dismissed him and the importance of that conversation. And he refused to continue that conversation, and I really learned a lesson in that moment that sometimes we have to put our phones in the back seat, so to speak, metaphorically. Switch them off when we actually have an opportunity to be with our children, because our opportunities of being fully present are actually quite rare, because we have so much multitasking going on, whether we're working while we're trying to communicate, or driving, or shopping, or we're often doing 2 things at once. And our teens, as Savannah said, need for us to role model good communication skills. The same goes for, you have your cell phone at the dinner table. If you don't want them to have their cell phones at the dinner table, then you can't either. The same rules apply. What's good for the goose is good for the gander. So this is a very visual generation of young people, and they take in more cues from what they see than from what they hear. And that means that we have to be as congruent as possible in what we do and what we say, because they will do what we do, not what we say.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. Especially because most teenagers, the cry of most parents is, my teenager doesn't tell me anything. So I always think that when you have those moments where your teenager is telling you something, is wanting to communicate, or, maybe bounce something off you or speak through something that's going on, if we, for those moments, just give them our undivided attention, we are really then building that connection that we all actually want to be having with our teen. So I think one of the really useful ways to identify how to have a more connected experience with your teen is through these connection styles that we work with, that are very simple, very easy to use and identify, and can often be such a small thing that can just really shift your relationship. And so the first connection style is the talkers versus non-talkers. Your child and yourself are either more of a talker or more of a non-talker. And if you want to pop in the chat, what do you think you are? Are you more of a talker or more of a non-talker? And what do you think your teen is? Are they more of a talker or a non-talker? And what's interesting about this is, if you've got a non-talking teen and you are a talking parent, you want to have conversation, and you want to say to your teen, how was your day? What did you do? What happened? He said, what? How was the taste? If your child is a non-talking child, that is really too confrontational for them. They can't give you answers right now. They're not those people who are going to tell you their thoughts immediately. So what's very useful with a non-talking child is to often speak about yourself. So often start the conversation with, I've had such an interesting day, this happened, that happened. Let them sink into the conversation, and they might then pipe up. They then have the opportunity to pipe up and say, oh, that's interesting. Tell me more about that. And that's the way that you'll find your way. They're not good children to have confrontational direct questions with, because they just withdraw and they shut down. You do need to have some kind of sit down face to face with a non-talker. What you need to do is state your case as a talking person and say to them, I know that you need time to think about this. Let's have tea later or an early breakfast tomorrow so that you can give me your thoughts on what I have said. Because if you give them time to process it, they have a lot to say. It's not that they don't want to talk. They just talk in a different way. But if you've got a lot of talkers in your house, the non-talkers never get a word in edgeways, because talkers like to finish each other's sentences. They're terrible interrupters. They talk over each other. If you have two talkers, they both talk at the same time and they sort of hear what the other person's saying, and they have this whole way of doing it. That's a nightmare for a non-talker. So if you are a talker and you're trying to wrestle information out of your non-talker, you're not actually building a connection. You're creating more of an alienation. And your teen is going to start dodging you because they don't want to be put on the spot again. Nikki, I know you've got a talker and a non-talker.
Yes, I do. So my eldest son is a talker. I'm a talker. So that makes it a very easy relationship. But my youngest son is a non-talker. And even pre-teens, I picked that up, very early on, that he was not a talker. My need is for him to talk to me. He doesn't have a need to talk. And understanding that has actually been a very important part of building a relationship with him. And I've had to learn when I'm in the car, and it's quite hard as a talker, not to interrogate him, because me trying to start a conversation because he doesn't talk back sounds like an interrogation. And actually, if I just shut up, he will eventually talk in his own time, or start off by talking about, something entirely different, like, I heard XYZ, what do you think about that? Or apparently this happened at school. Is it true? So you're not actually focusing on them. And then to do things like cook together, or walk or run, or take the dogs for a walk, or whatever it is, doing something that doesn't keep the spotlight on that person is very interesting. And, even in this COVID time, we've picked up in classroom situations with kids, especially in the teens, the teachers are saying those teens who normally wouldn't have put their hand up in the classroom are doing quite fine on online education, because they feel more incognito. So they're happier to put their hand up and ask a question, put it in the chat. And we have the same in company meetings, that the people who are the non-talkers who don't usually get airtime are actually getting far more involved in the chat box than the talkers, or than they would have in a real life situation. So it's so interesting. This dynamic is a very important part of building healthy communication.
Absolutely. And of course, the challenge often as a parent comes in if you are a non-talker and you have a child who's a non-talker, which is not a problem at all. The two of you are very happy to sit in silence, and that's great. And as Nikki said, doing those things like walking the dog or doing cooking is a particularly useful tool for non-talkers, especially if you're both non-talkers, because it's non-confrontational. You're not sitting looking at each other. You are pottering around, you're doing stuff, and you can have a conversation without it feeling like it's too intense for you. If you have a talker child and you're a non-talker, often non-talkers can find talking children quite overwhelming. They sort of, it's a lot.
Sensory overload.
Yeah. But I really ask you to do some breathing and to manage that, response in yourself, because talkers need to feel heard, and their talking is the way that they work things out. So a non-talker is processing internally to find their answer. A talker is processing externally. So they don't need a response from you. They don't need your agreement. They just need you to listen, because what they're doing is they're thinking aloud, and in hearing themselves say all of this stuff and tell you the whole story, they will then come to their endpoint or their solution or whatever it was they were looking for. And often they'll walk away going, thanks, that was, thanks for the good chat. And you never said a word. But talkers need that. They need you to hear them exclusively without, all of the distractions and the interruptions.
So Lola, are you a talker or a non-talker?
I mean, I seem like I'm not a talker now, but she's
You're holding back. You're really holding back.
Yeah. So I mean, I have one talker and one who's not a terrible non-talker. I mean, she's kind of on the cusp, but she is more of a non-talker. But I'm in relationship with a non-talker. My husband is a non-talker. And it caused quite a lot of friction initially in our relationship until I learned about this interesting connection styles info. And now, this is exactly what I do. If we have a discussion around something, I say to him, we'll have you come back to me when we have coffee tomorrow morning. Now, the trick is to make sure that you do that you invite your non-talker to come back with their thoughts, because otherwise they just slip away and you realize that a few days later they never actually told you what they thought. So you need to be quite on it in order to come back to where you were and get their perspective. But it really is a game changer, because talkers assume that it's easy for everybody to talk, and it's a big mistake to make. Then the next connection style is touches versus non-touches. So some people are far more physically touchy, people who converse with you, and as they're talking, they're touching your shoulder or they're holding your elbow and they like to hug you, hello. And then you've got your non-touchers who have quite big personal space. They don't like to stand too close to anybody. They don't like their hand being held. They definitely don't like uninvited hugging. And I think you can spot, which one you are, which one your teen is. So maybe you want to pop that in the chat box for us. Are you a toucher, non-toucher? What is your teen? And the thing with touchers is that they experience a lot of the experience of love for them is related to touch. So they are your kids, as smaller kids, they would have wanted to cuddle you. They would have wanted to sit on your lap a lot. And even as teens, although most people's teens don't really want to hug them anymore, your touchers will still want to hug you. And often with a toucher, if they're going through something, if they've had a terrible day or they've had issues with their friends, just sitting close to them and holding their hand or giving them a cuddle is all they need. Very often, non-talkers are more touching people. And so they don't want to talk the whole situation out. But if you're just physically close to them and sort of be with them without the talking, that is really important for them. Non-touchers, on the other hand, the moment you touch a non-touching person, they actually lose their ability to think. They get so freaked out that their thinking shuts down. So you need to be really aware, because just as with being a talker, you don't take into consideration being a toucher. It never occurs to you that anybody would be uncomfortable. It's such a warmth for you. And you will be able to spot non-touchers a mile off. They really don't like anybody being too close to them physically. And that's also quite tough for parents, because they have, they want to cuddle and be close to their children. And very often for non-touching children, they can have a little moment of that, but they really, it's not their thing,
Yeah. My non-talker child is also a non-toucher. And so it's a double whammy for me. And as he, when they're little and you want to snuggle into their necks, he was fine when he was little. But as he grew older, he'd go, and even now as a teen and then as a young man, I take my long nails and go and tickle the back of his neck if he's working. And he'll go, Mum, and he's also the child who, I learned that it's not that they don't want you near them. It's not that they don't want to connect with you, but you do have to respect their space. So when he was doing homework as a teenager, and say we, hadn't spent much time together, if I just went and lay on his bed or lay on his floor and said absolutely nothing, but just lay there sort of holding the space for him, he would love that. And the interesting thing is, eventually they start to talk to you. So if it's comfortable for them, something will eventually happen.
Absolutely. Absolutely. The moment you give that non-talker enough silence for them to gather their thoughts, they start to talk, and you are like, who is this child? Where did they come from? But we never give them enough space for them to sort of launch into their story. So these are things that you can notice about yourself. And for me, and I know for Nikki as well, the parenting journey has really been about my own journey as an individual. What's coming up for me? What can I do about it? And I think often as parents, we think we're supposed to create these children, mold them into something. And for me, that's not really what it's about. For me, it's about, why is this triggering me? What's going on? Let me sort out my own reactiveness, and let my teen learn to do the same. So that's not to say I accept, bad behavior, and we're going to have a look at boundaries later on in the conversation. But investigating myself and what I can do to shift things in the relationship is really powerful, because that's all I really have charge of, is what I can bring. I can't demand that my teen is another way in order to have a workable relationship. That's not within my control.
So I think you raised a very important word there. You talked about being reactive. And as a parent, our responsibility is to be less reactive and more responsive. And that means that we take a breath before we react. There's that gap between stimulus and response, and your teens are going to trigger you. And I always like to talk about parenting as the most incredible personal development adventure you will ever have, because your children see you 360 degrees. They discover parts of you that you never knew existed until you had a child. And as they grow and develop, they trigger different parts of you. And so you're going to learn and discover more and more about how you show up in the world, what triggers you, what makes you do the things you do, and why. And we need to have a vested interest in that, because when your children ultimately leave home, and I hope that's sooner rather than later, and I say that very guardedly because we know we're living with a generation that is failing to launch. And there are many, many young people still at home between 27 and 35 years of age today. And guys, that's a very expensive business if you want to keep looking after your children for all of those years. So our goal as parents is actually to let our children go and lead lives independently of us. And Savannah often uses the word, we want to raise courageous and fearless young people. And in order to do that, the basis is in sound communication skills, because life doesn't unfold in a straight line. Some of the conversations that teens are going to have with other teens and other people, maybe teachers, etc., might not be pleasant conversations. Life is not a bed of roses. There are going to be times when we have to stand up for ourselves and say, I don't agree with this, and I'm not going to do that, and I'm not going to swallow this, and I'm not going to have sex right now, and I don't want to drink because I'm not there yet. Are our children able to have such courageous conversations? Do they have a value system? And that all comes through communication.
Absolutely. And I think what's key here is to remember that it is up to us, I feel, as the parents, to facilitate opportunities for face-to-face conversation with our children every single day. So whether, we often mostly do it at dinner time. It's the time when, there's the least pressure and nobody's got to rush and do anything else. But I feel as if our teens are bordering on a generation that doesn't know how to have a conversation. And we have to manage our own level of digital communication with our teens, because they are physically with us, and we need to encourage the art of face-to-face communication and conversation. So it's to have those moments at supper time when everybody takes a turn to say how their day was, what was great, what was terrible, highs and lows, or sweets and sours, whatever you call them. keep doing that with your teen because they need it now more than ever. That might be the only time that you actually connect with them. You know, you've moved from the center of their world to being on the fringe because their social group is now the center of their world. So it's really important that you get eyes on communication with your teen as regularly as possible. And what's great about doing a round of something at supper is that everybody takes turns and nobody interrupts. And if you've got non-talking children or you're a non-talker, that's a great framework to invite them to participate. They know that when it's their turn, everyone will wait for them and allow them to speak versus having just this general, supper time conversation where everybody's butting in and then the talkers will rule and the non-talkers will just eat their supper and go, move on afterwards. So encouraging your children to tell you things face to face, to have difficult conversations, so that they know that they can. They know that they will come out the other side and have survived that. And one of the things, it can be pretty tough, but it's an invitation I'm giving you, is that I have a deal with both my girls that if there's something that they want to tell me, but the reason they're not going to tell me is because they don't want to have a whole conversation about it and they don't want 20 questions, then they just have to say up front, I'm going to tell you something and I don't want to talk about it. And I say, okay. And then they tell me whatever it is they want to tell me. However, it only works because I 100% honor that agreement. At no point do I say, look, I know I said I wasn't going to ask you anymore, but I'm really, could I just, because then they're not going to do it again. They're not going to talk to you again. And what we want is for our teenagers to be able to be real with us, not to think they have to be perfect. We don't want our teenagers to tell us what they think we want to hear. We want to hear what is real, what is actually going on. But if we are continually overreactive and judgmental every time they tell us something, then they're just going to shut down the communication. So as I said before, how am I going to manage myself in order to create this really connected relationship wherein my teen is courageous enough to tell me the truth because I manage my own reactiveness around it? It's a tough one. Nobody's saying it's easy,
And that means that, our teens might also develop different points of view and we may disagree. And I think we are so brought up to believe that disagreements are bad things, but actually they are the stimulus for perhaps a really robust conversation. And, it might raise all our levels of thinking if we are allowed to disagree in a conversation. And just going back to this face-to-face time and creating sacred space for non-interrupted family time. We always use dinner time as our time together. In fact, if my husband or I had to work late at night, we would make sure we came back from work, had dinner, and then we'd go back to work, or I'd go back into my home office. And that happened for some years quite often. But our children knew we would be at the dinner table. And when my son, my eldest, was in matric, writing prelims, I'll never forget him coming to the dinner table one day saying, guys, this is my best time of the day. This is because he wasn't having a great year. Matric's hard. And, this was his 1 hour where he could just chill and relax. And he said just knowing we would always be there was important to him. And he said, not many of my friends have this privilege. And I thought, coming from an 18-year-old boy, that was quite some statement, that he looked forward to that moment of the day over and above everything. And my husband passed away 3 years ago almost. And what is the thing that we miss most as a family? And it's dinner together, and it's washing the dishes together, and it's the conversation that happened around the dinner table, or when we were doing a sharing or a clearing, the sweets and the sours, where everyone got an opportunity to speak, or whether it was flicking each other with the dish towels and the shrieks of hilarity that break the tension and we've got to keep our sense of humor with our teens. We've got to do things that break the seriousness of this intensity. Lola, how intense is it being a teenager?
If I could put it into words, I would.
So we've got to remember that the hormones are going up and down. And in the space of 24 hours, our teens can feel just a very wide continuum of emotions. So, they're evolving every day. And we have to also allow for this flexibility in how they show up every day.
Absolutely. So I think the last very quickly connection style that I'll touch on is the pain, no pain child. And very often non-talkers, once again, will be more your pain children, and they will communicate with you through ailments. They are children who have sore tummies or an earache, and they've always got a little bit of a thing going on. And as they become teenagers, that doesn't go away. For many younger teenagers, they still use that pain mechanism to tell you that they're not okay. So it's up to you as a parent to identify, is this really sore tummy, or is the child trying to say something to me? And my other daughter is a pain child, and very often she'll say, she's got a sore tummy, and I'll say, what's going on? She'll go, no, nothing. And then I just sit, and sit on her bed and just wait a little bit, and then she'll go, well, actually, and then I hear the whole story. So it's not to disregard that pain. It's not to make small of it and say, oh, come on, you've always got a tummy ache, stop being such a baby. It's to hear it. It's to hear that there's something going on that you need to pay attention to. And as Lola and Nikki were saying, being a teenager is very intense and very overwhelming for some, especially in those early teenagers when all of that hormonal stuff kicks in. It can be quite a fearful time. They feel a bit mad. They feel like they're not themselves, and
like not in control. Not in control of themselves as they used to be. And I think that's very, very big. There are 3 questions that our children ask us non-verbally every single day at every age and stage. Do you see me? Do you hear me? Am I important to you? These are critical questions. They don't even know they're asking us these questions. So be very aware. And, when we're talking of the pain child, this could be, do you hear me? Might not be the words I'm speaking. It might be the words I'm not speaking, the words I can't speak. It might be through the pain. And I have my non-talker, non-toucher is also a pain child. And he's just had his 21st birthday, and my eldest son, in his speech, broke down the word Matthew, M-A-T-T-H-E-W, and had a word for each of the letters. And the word for A was achy. He said, I've never known such an achy person. You always have some complaint about what's hurting you. And it's so true. It's so, so true. So it is listening between the words. And I think that the non-talker often expresses through pain, but not necessarily. I have to tell you that I am a talker, toucher, pain person.
Yeah.
So,
the thing is, if you're a no pain person and you have a pain child, I'm a no pain person. So I'm a terrible nurse. I'm absolutely awful. I mean, ask Lola, if ever you said, like, I've got a headache or I don't feel well, I would tell them to go and get a glass of water, until eventually they would say, I've got a headache and I've already had a glass of water. And so I'm very intolerant of other people's pain. And so as a no pain parent, I've had to manage that, especially because I have a pain child, not to just disregard it. It really is painful. People who are pain people really feel that pain deeply. So if you are a no pain parent with a pain child, it's a big one, because if the minute you disregard it, they don't feel seen, they don't feel heard, and they don't feel important.
Yeah. So something else that can help you in understanding your children and their communication styles and how to connect more effectively with them is also the concept of the 5 love languages. These are Gary Chapman's 5 love languages, and you have words of affirmation, physical touch, gifts, quality time, and acts of service. And if you add this to what we've just spoken about, it can really be helpful. So my non-talker, non-toucher pain child is a quality time act of service child. So if you bake for him, so my mother always baked on a Sunday because he went to boarding school on a Monday morning, she was his hero. He felt so loved. If I make a meal, he feels loved. If we go shopping together, even if he doesn't need me to help him make a decision, just being with him fills his emotional cup. So how are you connecting with your child that makes them feel loved? It's like me. Give me a gift without a card and words, or give me a gift without a hug and saying something to me means absolutely nothing. You might as well not have given me the gift, no matter how big or small. It's what comes with it that is important to me. You change my light bulb, I feel like you love me because I'm an acts of service person. So I'm a words person and an act of service person. So just bear that in mind too. Gives you additional clues to help understand your child and to deliver communication in a way that will fill your child's emotional cup.
Yeah. So I am a quality time words of affirmation, and I know my mom's, and I know my dad's, and I know my sister. And first of all, I think that take the test together, because once you identify each other's love languages, you are able to show your love to one another. And so, because I said I'm a quality time, just before I'm about to go to bed, I'll speak to my parents, I'll speak to my mom, and I'll speak to my dad. And that is the time where I look forward to and I feel most love, because I have that one-on-one time with each of them separately. Because if I were to be with my sister, it wouldn't count. So just that one-on-one time is big love.
Yeah, so quality time is only banked if it's one-on-one. It's not banked as family time, doesn't feed that river. And what's great about it is that this is not only for you to know what your children are. This is for your children to know what you are. I think we've come from such a child-centric way of raising teens. It's been all about them. And we need to, I'm all for parents' rights. We matter. So I said, so Lola says, I know what my mom's love language is and what my sister's. So in inviting them to learn about their love language and see what it all means, I've told them about me. What's my love language? How does it matter to me to be loved? What is important?
Acts of service. That's it.
So what do you have to do to make her feel loved? It's actually quite easy, isn't it?
If I turn on her electric blanket, if I pack the dishwasher, if I clean the car.
True. And they know that. And so the thing is, if we've got different love languages, I'm doing stuff because that's my love language. I'm doing lots of things for them, but neither of them are primary acts of service love languages. So it's not that it doesn't count. It's just that it's not as impactful as that half an hour that Lola has me to herself at the end of the day. So also, I hope useful for you. And we will send you the resources for the love language quiz. They've got one for adults. There it is. One for teens and one for kids. If you've still got smaller kids, there's 4 different quizzes. And it's a fun way to introduce the concept of, connection and communication in a new light with your teens.
So Lola, you've got some more do's and don'ts, I think, also related to communication and empowering your teen to communicate for themselves and find their own voice. Give us your lowdown here.
Right. So literally, like he said, don't speak for us in situations. Always empower us to speak for ourselves. From a very young age, my mom always taught me to speak for myself. To order what I wanted at a restaurant or to tell the doctor what was wrong. And to this day, I still feel very comfortable with that. Also, if I have cut my hair or I have bought something new and someone comes to ask me about it, she doesn't automatically take over the conversation and say, oh, she's been meaning to cut her hair for a long time. And yeah, we went to go and buy it. Just be quiet. Let us speak. don't say, I know you better than you know yourself. This is a really big one because we're already struggling to find out who we are. So by you saying that diminishes the journey and creates anxiety. Don't have conflict in the morning because, like we said, our emotions are amplified by 1,000. So then we run the whole day at school and dread coming home because even this little argument just triggered us and set it off for the whole day. And don't shout at or humiliate us in front of our friends. It's worse for the friends than it is for us. So please be mindful of that.
Some really great things to remember. And I think that if we think of each of those situations, I'm sure we can all remember a situation as a teenager ourselves when our mom or dad did that and we were just mortified. So take a moment to remember yourself as a teenager and remember how hectic it was. And it makes us a little bit more compassionate towards this emotional roller coaster that our teenagers are on. We seem to take it so personally, what's going on with our teen. We take it as if they're just being mean to us or they're just being rude to us. It is intense. So just remember that and minimize. I love this one. When we asked Lola to write these, and she came up with some such interesting ones. And this one about don't have conflict in the morning, something I'd never even thought of. That of course it impacts their whole day. So I think they're great things to be mindful of as you start, new ways of communicating with your team.
And even if you think that we don't want your opinion or we don't want to speak to you, what you actually say is very valuable to us, even if it doesn't seem like it.
Yeah, you remind me, Lola, of a conversation I had with my son when he was the learner driver. We were crossing an intersection. And we saw a guy on a motorbike do something really, really stupid and nearly have an accident. And his comment was, you see, young motorcycle riders don't have an adult in the passenger seat helping them learn how to drive properly. And he said, I'm so lucky because I've got you here helping me to learn the ropes, and it's a little bit like putting fairy wheels on in a way, being there, but increasingly putting in space between you and your teen. As your teen becomes more responsible, let out the kite strings more and more and more. But always remembering that they're in the process of becoming. So I liked what you said there. I know you better. I think I know you better than you know yourself. Actually, guys, we have to be really careful of that one. Because you know them as the compliant primary school child. They are actually changing quite dramatically in front of your eyes. And I know we don't like that because they're out of our control. That's what we don't like, is we can't put them back in the box and tie the ribbon. They're out now. And so we have to work with that and work with the spreading of the wings. And that means that we don't get rid of the boundaries. We just keep creating a bit more space. But remember, you can always bring the boundaries in when need be. But it is about holding the space for your developing teen. They don't want you to let go completely. They want you to be there, but be there in a different way.
Absolutely. And I think one of the ones that's most important for me as well about this is when she said, don't speak for your teen, empower them to speak for themselves. I think we've had this generation of parents who've wanted to smooth the way for their children, who've wanted to step in, handle difficult situations, have the difficult conversations, especially around a school situation where they're interacting with adults, that the parents get in the way and they sort of sort it all out. We're not doing our children any service by doing that, because we are not always going to be there to smooth the path. Our children need to learn to engage with adults. High school, you should really not be engaging with your teachers or your principal at all. You should be empowering your teen to talk it through with you. What is it they're going to say? How will they say it? You can role play a little bit. I'll be the teacher. You say what you've got to say. This is a time where we give them the tools to go and do it themselves and really have to get out of their way and allow them to sink or swim, because sinking is where they're going to learn their greatest life lessons. We can't keep trying to step in and stop those difficult moments for them. They have to go through them because it makes them more confident. They know they will be able to. And the more confident they get around their communication skills, the better it is for us. Because as teenagers, we need to know that they are empowered to speak up. We need to know that they're not fearful of being the only one standing up saying, no, I don't want to, or that's not okay for me. We need to know that. And the way you do it is by fostering them to speak for themselves and saying, you believe they can do it. I know you can do this. I know it might seem scary. I know it feels overwhelming. I know you can do it. And you're going to feel so much better afterwards. So really stop speaking for them. That time is long gone. Long gone.
It's such a common thing. And maybe that leads into sibling fairness because, what we do know about siblings, particularly with communication styles like a talker, non-talker, your talker child can sometimes talk for the non-talker. And the non-talker actually gets into a habit of not bothering because they know their sibling is going to step in and speak for them. And that can actually lead to some antagonism and resentments and anger that could be simmering beneath the surface that you don't even know about. So let's talk a little bit about sibling fairness, because what we know from this series that we've been running, and I don't know how many of these teen workshops we've run over the past few months, but it comes up as such a big hot button for every audience, that sibling fairness is an issue. And we'd love to hear from you in the chat if sibling fairness is an issue in your home.
Absolutely. I think, as we all know, our firstborn child is the one that we try out all the things, all the rules, all the readings, all the articles get practiced on our firstborn child. And we're definitely going to do this and we're never going to do that. And by the time, we have our second child, we realize that a lot of that doesn't really matter one way or another. So we're a little bit more free, and it doesn't seem to be as hard or as strict for them. But we need to really be mindful around being appropriately fair with our first child and our subsequent children. Because I'm a firstborn. I have a sister who's 5.5 years younger than me. And very often growing up, I would bring to my parents' attention the seemingly unjust difference in what we were allowed. My favorite example is just very briefly that my father had an absolute thing about ear piercing. He felt it was such a permanent decision, and I was allowed quite a lot of other freedoms, but one of the things that was not negotiable was that I was not allowed to pierce my ears till I was 18, which I thought was the most ridiculous rule in the history of the world and completely unfeminist behavior, and got very on my high horse about it. When I was 15, went and got them done. It did not go well. It was probably the most serious breakdown my father and I ever had. And I subsequently took them out 24 hours later, waited till I was 18. And when I was 18, I went and had my ears pierced. My sister, when she was 14, went and got her ears pierced, and there was never a word said about it. She didn't have the same rule. And I remember having an absolute moment of feeling so defeated that it had been such a big thing in my life and that I'd had to hold out, and it had really been hard and it had really been awful. And there was just a completely different set of rules for my sister. And so I think often with parents, we have rules around the firstborn. We're trying to do the best we know how. We're reading a lot of information and we, on forums and trying to be the best parent. And what happens is that, especially if your children are closer in age, so for instance, my girls are 2.5 years apart, is that we begin to allow things with the second one because it just seems easier. Yes, okay, your sister's 16 and she's going to watch a movie that's, rated for 16-year-olds. And then the little sister sneaks in there and I'm like, is it such a big deal? Well, actually, these things are a big deal because Lola wasn't allowed to watch those movies until she was 16. So it can seem like it's a bit more work, but if we aren't mindful around these things, no matter what those boundaries are, money is a big one. Are you giving your kids fair amounts of money compared to their age? You can't give a 16-year-old and a 13-year-old the same pocket money. That's the same allowance. That's just not fair. Because when your 16-year-old was 13, they weren't getting the allowance. So we do things in the name of convenience that often cost us in the long run and will definitely impact on our children's relationships with each other. So it's a very good time to check in with yourself. Where are the rules and boundaries? What are I know, Nikki, you've got a lovely thing around rites of passage. What is going on between your children, and where do you need to just reassess and reclaim some fair behavior?
So rites of passage include things like pocket money changes to an allowance. How much is the allowance? What must the allowance cover? Your children, a 13-year-old is not going clubbing and going to parties, but a 17-year-old is. So what they need to, what their expenses are, differs completely. Then, what movies they watch, gaming, computer gaming, there are age restrictions on these things for a reason. Rites of passage, like getting your first smartphone, being able to be on social media, technically, guys, 13 technically is the age. We'll get on to social media and that sort of thing just now. But, those are things your children are watching. They really are. And when it comes to money, it's beyond what we're talking about here. And I'll give you an example. So one day your children might do some tertiary education studies. And when my eldest son went off to university at the age of 18 after matric, we had an agreement with him very clearly that if he failed any subjects, he would have to pay for redoing them the next year or rewriting the exam. It was so cast in stone, so clear that when he did fail a subject, we never had to go to him and say, right, you owe. He actually came to us and said, what do I owe? As soon as you get the bill, let me know. And then my youngest son came along and he went off to university just post my husband's traumatic death. And so I wasn't thinking about agreements with my youngest son. I really wasn't on that page at all. So yes, I can absolutely write this off to trauma. But the upshot of this is really quite sobering. So when he got to the end of his second year, he had an emotional wobbly, very delayed post-traumatic stress, and he was unable to write 2 of his exams. So he had to carry 2 subjects into the following year. And something happened with my kids at the end of last year, and they got into a bit of a sticky situation. And in speaking to both of them post this situation, I tried to find out what had gone on. And when I spoke to my eldest son, I said, I feel like you threw your younger brother under the bus in this situation. Are you angry at him for any rhyme or reason? And he looked at me as if I was nuts and said, no. And something in me just came up. This word resentment came up for me. And I said, is there anything about your younger brother that you resent? And that hit a nerve for him. And he said, yes. He said, he is not going to have to pay for those subjects that he failed. And I had to. And that had obviously been simmering for about 6 weeks. And it came to the surface in behavior between them. And really what had happened to them was quite serious, actually. So it just showed me how important this whole sibling fairness thing really, really is. So when you do start paying things like allowances and creating agreements with your eldest child, make sure you keep a note that you're not going to lose, because you are going to have to refer back to that with the next sibling that comes along.
Right. So just my quick story about it. So it's also an airing story. A few years ago, my sister decided to cut her hair very, very short, like very short. And a lot of people would mistake her for a boy. And it made her very upset. And me being the first child, if anyone just touched my sister, I would be like, what are you doing? Very defensive. And I would hate to see my sister upset. And so I went to my mom and I said, do you think we should ask her if she wants to get her ears pierced?
Because you'd had to wait.
Until
you were 13.
Yeah. And she said, yeah, let's go and ask. And eventually we did. But it was okay because I had initiated that. So it wasn't unfair.
And I think that if you want to know how you're doing on the fairness front, the best thing to do is ask your children, especially your firstborn, because very often firstborns are the ones that take the brunt of this unfairness. And because they are sort of responsible children and often feel like they're the other parent to the other siblings, they let quite a lot slide, but they don't really. It's all, they're clocking it in there.
Like I remember things that are even crazy. Like even with my sister, if we get ice cream, I will bring up like the scale to make sure that we each have the same amount. You know, there's something between siblings that's just, yeah.
Really.
That's so funny what you've just said, because my youngest will do things like, okay, so like, for example, you can all have an ice cream. Okay, so what can we have? You know, how much can we spend? And then he might say, well, then I don't want the ice cream. Can I use the money for X?
Yes.
Yeah. So check in with your kids, because there must be something festering in there that is like you haven't even thought of, you know, and you can just dismantle that and make it a little bit more.
Diffuse it. Yeah.
Yeah.
You can lead to very interesting conversations with your children.
Yeah. Absolutely. So do we have some more do's and don'ts?
We do.
Right. Okay. So don't be overprotective. You need to give us space so that we can learn for ourselves and make mistakes. Do keep clear boundaries, like we've been saying, with your other children that you have with your first child. Be fair and don't compare. Do speak up and apologize when you've done something wrong, because that teaches us it's okay to be wrong. We just need to own it. And don't get irritated with us when we are irritated, because like we've been saying this whole time, our emotions are insane. Don't take it personally.
And I think that's such a great sentence to remember as the parent of a teen. Don't take it personally. You know, so often I see this thing with irritated teens where they get irritated and then the parent gets irritated with them being irritated and says, don't speak to me like that. And then the teen is like, oh, you know, and wanders off, and then everybody's all riled up. Teenagers are irritable. It is part of being a teenager. If you continually overreact to that, then both of you are going to be very unhappy campers. So very often, if Lola's, you know, having an overloaded afternoon and she's snappy with me and she's a bit irritated, I just take absolutely no notice. Because what happens in families is this thing called emotional contagion, where we catch other people's emotion. And it is so unnecessary, and it takes so much energy, and it just, you know, leaves everybody feeling less than, as opposed to let your teen be irritated or whatever else they're going through, and you be you. You do you, and they do them. And it just diffuses it, because often when they speak in that irritated way, we really think it's something we've done and we must now try and fix it. And 9 times out of 10, it's really got nothing to do with you.
Yeah.
Very important. I mean, the other little word that Lola threw in there, which we didn't address in sibling fairness, is her sentence says, be fair and don't compare. And that really, comparison is a big one. There's nothing more disempowering than being compared. So if you've got one child who's good at sport and another child who's average at sport, you know, don't be saying to your average child, you know, you could be as good as your brother if you just tried harder. I mean, these are just so terrible for a child to feel as if they are not enough for you, with their own set of talents and skills and uniqueness.
And it's not just comparing your siblings. One of my nephews was compared to my youngest son on a regular basis. I wish you were more like so-and-so. And can I tell you that it has impacted on the relationship between these cousins a lot. They used to be very close, and they're not close anymore. And that is partly due to what the one mum said, what one of my sisters said too often to her son. And I don't have a perfect child. Believe you me, there isn't a perfect child. Our children are all different, and we need to value them for who they are not who we wish they would be. And I think that is so important, is that we need to let go of the pictures that we have of the child we wish we had. And we have to work with what we've been given. We live in pictures, and sometimes those pictures are really destructive to our relationships.
Absolutely. So I'm just going to very quickly go over a stat that I like to use that really has made a big impact for me in my life, and that was something I read from the Gottman Institute around the ratio of appreciation to criticism in good, working, successful relationships. And what they said is that ratio should be 5 to 1. And that means that in terms of our relationships, for every criticism or negative piece of feedback we give somebody, we need to counter that with 5 pieces of positive feedback or genuine, heartfelt appreciations. And this is something you look at in sort of a bigger picture scenario. If I didn't manage to get to all 5 today, maybe tomorrow I've got no negative and a couple of additional positives. But what happens when you look at the relationship with your teen, especially, because it can be quite an emotional time for everybody, is that we tend to err on the side of negative communication. We're often telling our teens, why can't you do this? Can't you do that? Why do I have to ask you this 1,500 times? Why is your room such a pigsty? Oh my goodness, is that what you're going to wear? There's a lot of triggering negative commentary from parents of teens. And if you want to start fostering a different relationship with your teenager, really have a look at how often you appreciate or acknowledge them for something that is about them, not something that they have done, not an achievement. We live in an achievement-oriented culture. So it's not something that they have or something they've done, but for who they are. So it's not, when my girls they know I'm an active service person, when they pack the dishwasher, I'm not appreciating the fact that they pack the dishwasher. That is the symptom of what I'm appreciating. What I'm appreciating is that they know me and they love me enough to do something that they know matters to me. And so those are the kinds of things that we need to be noticing. What is it about who your teens are that you can acknowledge and appreciate? And it will make a significant difference in your relationship, because interestingly enough, in relationship, as in life, we will always find what we're looking for. And if we are looking for the negatives, we will find them in abundance. And when we start looking for the positives, we will find them in abundance. So maybe we just need to change the filter of our glasses from negative to positive. And it's not that there are no negatives. Of course there are. This is real. But how well balanced is your communication with your teen in that regard?
And it can be simple things, If you're a quality time person and your teen comes to speak to you, say to them, thank you so much for taking the time to come to speak to me. Like, this really made my day. Thank you.
Awesome.
And from my mom saying that, or like me saying that to my mom, I've learned to say that to my friends as well. Like, your relationships isn't just your little family circle. It goes beyond that, So, to use these life lessons have not just been in my family, to be in my friends and other people.
Because this is what we're doing. We're teaching our children to be ready for the world. We're teaching them to be ready for their next set of families, which is their friends or their co-workers. This is where they are going to learn all of that stuff.
Yeah, so I think we've got to pick our battles, not fight every battle all on one day. I think we've dealt a lot with boundaries and priorities so far, but I think you've got one basic rule, haven't you, around bedrooms that you stick to. So Lola's bedroom is allowed to be how?
Oh, yes. So my bedroom is my space, right? So if I have... I better be careful when I say this now. I'm allowed to paint my wall within reason and decorate it how I want, because that's my sacred space. But the 2 things that I'm not allowed to have is wet towels and dishes.
There you go. It is her space. You've got to allow them that freedom, in my opinion. Close the door, people. Just close the door and walk on by.
and have very, very few rules. As few rules as possible will get you into far less confrontation. Do you want to pick that up, Savannah?
Yeah, so I think the other thing to be mindful of in terms of moving from tweens to teens is that it's a time to reassess boundaries and ground rules with your children. You know, the things that might have been relevant in that 8 to 12 category are shifting now that they're teenagers. You're now going to have to setting boundaries around things like parties, you know, going out,
curfews,
all the other joys that come with teenage parenting. So it's a good time to do that. And I recommend, first of all, I'm a believer that in terms of boundaries and rules, that actually teenagers are split into junior teenagers and senior teenagers. You know, there's rules and appropriateness for 13 to 15-year-olds, and 16 to 18-year-olds are different. Mm-hmm. So you need to do that age appropriately. And if you've got children that are, as I do, 13 and 16, they have their own sets of boundaries and ground rules. And then we have boundaries and ground rules as a family. You know, we are all in this family, and there's certain things that we all have to adhere to and contribute to in terms of chores, agreements, contributions, etc. However, what happens is that up until now, because our children have been compliant, we've always said, these are the rules, this is the way things are, and that's just, you know, been fine. Not so with teenagers. First of all, if you're going to set ground rules and boundaries, I recommend you do them up front. Do not make it up as you go along, because you're in for the pain of many, many negotiations and manipulations. Decide now what your hard boundaries are and make them as few as possible, really the ones that are meaningful for you. And then you have to have a discussion with your teen, and they have to put forward what their boundaries are around the other things that you're going to give them freedom to choose or to, you know, have a little bit more negotiation on. They need to be written down. They need to be finite. Everybody must be on the same page, and your teen needs to agree. If you think that you're going to lay down the rules and they are going to do it, it's not going to happen. They don't expect them to agree to something, to keep to something that they never agreed to. And the other things you want to do up front is to set the consequences for the breaking of those rules. Those need to be absolutely automatic, so that when it happens, if your child does overstep a boundary or break a ground rule, the consequence is automatic, and they were making a choice. They knew what the consequence was. And what they are learning is that actions have consequences. And what we've tended to do with previous generations is minimize those consequences. And so now we have a whole bunch of young adults out there who behave with impunity because they've never had to deal with a consequence. And when there are consequences, they're completely outraged about the whole happening. So to make your life easier as you embark or wherever you are on the teenage roller coaster, stated boundaries up front with automatic consequences and no negotiation from that point on. You renegotiate the ground rules as your child moves from one stage to another stage.
So there's an interesting conversation that I'd love you to share, Savannah, around the 1 to 10 scale of importance. Because
yes.
Sometimes it's important to understand when something is really important to your teen that you don't agree with, or vice versa. And I think you've got a nice little cameo that illustrates the point.
So what I wrote out for myself was that, in terms of, it started out with just in terms of things in the house, on a scale of 0 to 10, how important is this to me? And how important is it to the other person? So, for instance, my husband's far more of a neat freak than I am. I'm quite good with organized chaos. But there's some things that really drive him crazy that don't feature on my radar at all. And I noticed that they really drove him crazy. And I thought, you know what? On a scale of importance, this is probably about an 8 for him, that this is tidy here. On a scale of importance for me, this is like a 2. I don't care. And so I'm going to do it his way because it's an 8 for him. And I'm in relationship with this person. And so it's something that I started to practice with my children, specifically around parties and going out, is on a scale of 0 to 10, if you ask me, am I happy for my children to go out to parties? I would say, no. Of course not. And what teenage parent wants their children to be out there in the crazy world? However, on a scale of 0 to 10, on Lola's scale of importance, there are some parties that are maybe around 6, and there are some that are probably around about a 9.
Like a 50.
Or a 50 out of 10, exactly. And so we had a very interesting experience where she came to me and wanted to go to a party that was really a high red flag for me. It was just everything I don't agree with in a party. It was in a house with people that I don't know. It was somebody from another school. There were 2 brothers having this party. There were over 100 people going. These are all things that are not on my list of things that.
And I was 14, keep in mind.
And she was 14. And I could see that everything in her wanted to go to this, but she was really desperate. And so I thought, okay, well, let me just see really how high this is on her scale of importance. And I said to her, well, if you want to go to this party, what I need you to do is get me the mother's phone number. And she said, why do you want the phone number? And I said, well, first of all, I have to check that they're having a party. I have to check that she's going to be there, that there's going to be grown-ups at the party. She's a mother of 2 boys. Mothers of 2 boys don't think about parties like mothers of 2 girls are. So there's some stuff I'd like to tell her. And her eyes grew bigger and bigger, and I could just see, and she was, Mom, this is so embarrassing. And I said, well, take it or leave it. Anyway, it took 3 days, but she finally came back with the mom's name and the phone number after having sweated it out, having to go and speak to this boy whose party it was.
Oh my gosh.
You see, I mean, it was just terrible for her.
To this day, I'm still holding this embarrassment that those messages are sitting there. Can I have your, no, Mom's number? No.
She did it. She actually did it. And that showed me that this was incredibly high on her scale of importance. And she'd fought for it. She'd given me what I asked for. I had my message and conversation with the mom, and off she went to the party. And often I think it's also useful because I think teenagers feel pressure to say yes to every social engagement. And sometimes if you put a little bit of a question mark into it, they can use you as their excuse not to have to participate. And we have to remember that it's a great out to give our children, to be the bad parent. Oh, my mom's such a drag. She says I can't come. When actually they didn't really want to go, but they didn't have the words to say that themselves. So just measure how important is it for you versus how important is it for your teen. And if it's really important, how can you make it happen as opposed to shut it down?
Yeah, and I think, that leads quite nicely into, the last 2 topics that we want to touch on before we finish are teen sexuality and social media and cell phones, because our teens are connected to the world through their cell phones today, through social media. And it's a very, very important part of their lives, but it also requires boundaries. And so we are going to share with you a teen and tween cell phone contract, because if your child does have a smartphone, that means the whole world has access to your child, and your child has access to the whole world today. And the whole world is a very, very, very big place, and not everybody in that world has your child's best interests at heart. So when I run teen digital safety workshops, I always share a safety mantra, which is actually just as useful for them in the online space as it is in the real world space. And it speaks to what Savannah and Lola were just talking about in terms of making good choices. What we actually are doing when we're raising teens is raising them to make the best possible choice they can make when we are not around. And we're not around on social media, are we, Lola?
No.
Why are you on social media? So I love the fact that Lola tells us that they're on they'll be on the social media channels where parents aren't, because this is the only time they can have time away from us. So increasingly, you won't be in the same virtual spaces as your children. And increasingly, they will be going to sleepovers, parties, clubs, etc., tours, camps, whatever, where you aren't. What is the quality of their decision-making going to be like when they're not with you? This is really the crux of this conversation. And so when you do give them a cell phone, you need to go through this contract, and this contract actually gives you lovely conversation pieces. It expresses our wishes for you, with regard to your cell phone. Then there's a section on your responsibilities with regard to your cell phone and our responsibilities as your parents with regard to your cell phone. And this includes talking to your children about sharing naked selfies. It's a decision they actually almost need to make before they get that cell phone. They need to know that it's not if they're going to be asked for a naked selfie, it's when they're going to be asked for a naked selfie. And it's about having conversations about stranger danger, because strangers online are not men in white vans hanging around outside the school gate. They're insinuating themselves into conversations that you're having with your mates. You think you're having a conversation with a 16-year-old boy, but actually he's a 60-year-old man, because social media can lie, because photographs can lie about who's behind the photograph. So are you having conversations with your children around sexual harassment and bullying? Because 13-year-old girls can be asked 53 times for a naked selfie and eventually give in. And there was a young South African girl who gave in very recently after, I think, 52 attempts from one boy. And just to get rid of him, she said yes, and she did it. And she's now had to find a new identity and change her name. So we don't want our kids to fall foul of each other. And often kids do stupid things online because they're seeking attention. Every human being wants to be validated. They want to be noticed. And it's often when they're really feeling empty and like they're not being noticed that they do things to draw attention to themselves, like sharing a naked selfie or picking a fight with somebody and being very emotional online. That's not the time to go online when you're feeling emotional and weepy and hormonal. So these are conversations to have with your kids. In-app purchases, are you aware of those things? When your kids are doing computer gaming, that they can use your credit card if they know your credit card details to make in-app purchases. So this is all covered in the cell phone contract for tweens and teens. Very important that you use these as conversation starters with your children, that they know not to delete what's in the chat on WhatsApp. If they're being harassed and bullied, that's part of proof that it's happening. If you had to actually get a restraining order from the police or go to the school headmaster or headmistress, you would need proof. So they need to understand all these sorts of things that are going to keep them safe. You have one mind, you have one body, you have one reputation. This is the mantra. And they need to ask themselves, this is part of critical thinking and using this prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is very underdeveloped in teenagers. Is it good for my mind? What I'm watching, what I'm listening to, is it good for my mind? Is it good for my body? Am I putting myself at risk? Am I putting out too many contact details on social media? Am I using location settings on my photograph, when I'm taking photos? And those photos that I post on social media, if the location settings were on, somebody can interrogate those photos right back to your child's bedroom in your own house. And is it good for my reputation? So is what I am sharing right now good for my reputation or bad for my reputation? Because once we have pressed send, the publish button, we've lost control. We are the publisher. We've said it's okay. Even if our child decides to delete that naked selfie, it's out there. They cannot get it back. No matter how many people they say, please take it off your timeline, please take it off your timeline. That photograph will have found itself into thousands of people's timelines and they can never, ever get it back. So rather don't send it in the first place. So is it good for my mind, good for my body, good for my reputation in the real world, when they're in a party situation or in the online world? One mind, one body, one reputation is a brilliant thinking framework and a fantastic framework for a conversation with your children around the dinner table. You see something happening in the media, have that conversation at dinner and talk about the framework. What would you have done? Was it good for that person's mind, that body, that reputation? Ask those questions.
Lola's got her two things she'd like to say about social media.
Yeah. So do not, and I repeat, do not post pictures or information of us on social media without our permission. Please, this is a massive one. And don't share anything that we have discussed with you, with your friends, even if we haven't implied, don't say anything to anyone else.
And I think that social media has led us to a complete lack of respect for privacy in general, but especially because we feel a sense of ownership with our children. We feel we have the right to put their information, their pictures, or, their achievements out via our social media. Most of the teenagers that I deal with absolutely loathe it. They cannot stand the fact that their parents do that. So please check with your teens, especially if you're in that senior teen group. They all have their own social media platforms. They will curate and release what they want to the world in the way that they want to. And we have to be mindful of that as parents of teenagers. It's no longer our place. So, of course, the other thing that we have to be really willing to engage with our teens about and to have potentially difficult conversations about is sexuality. And these are conversations that we have to have now more than ever, because we're living in a time of mad amounts of accessible information. And if you don't have these conversations with your teenager, they're going to go and want to find those answers around sex, sexuality, and what it's all about from places that you don't want them looking. So I think, for we've had questions around, well, my child hasn't raised this yet. Can I raise it? If your child has not raised any kind of conversation about sex with you by the time they are 8 or 9, you need to have had that conversation. And as they head into the teenage years, you need to start adding to that conversation quite significantly. For me, as a mom of girls, my biggest conversation add-on to the sex, talking about sex and consent, etc., was around pornography. So as a mom of girls, I'm feeling quite bleak that almost every boy they encounter has definitely watched porn of some kind or another. We all know that most pornography, over 60 to 70% of porn, has got to do with, violent undertones, denigration of women. That's just the way it is. And that boys are heading into wanting to have sexual experiences with girls, thinking that it's going to be like it is in a porn movie. And that my girls have to understand that that's what boys might be expecting, and what are they going to be ready to say, and how are they going to handle it? Where is their line? I think parents of boys need to have conversations with their boy children to say, listen, this is not real world, my friend. Girls are not going to look like that, and they're not going to behave like that. We can't get away from these conversations. And I think we come from, maybe a generation where our parents didn't have easy conversations with us about sex. But as responsible parents in this time, we absolutely have to go there with our children.
Yeah, we have to be real about this, and the reality is if you have a boy, from the time they hit puberty, they're having a sexual thought every 4 seconds. So sex is front and center for them. It's part of where their hormones are and where their brains are. And it's about putting it in its place and acknowledging that that's where they're at. That doesn't mean that they can, be very public about these things, but it is acknowledging that that's, human sexuality is normal. Body changes are normal. And the average age of a girl's first sexual encounter today is 14. So that's why we need to be having these conversations sooner rather than later. And we have to get beyond having the conversation that's about having babies. When in the younger years, we tend to talk exclusively around how mums and dads make babies. We've got to get to a point where we are able to say to our kids that sex with another person is part of showing love with another person or to another person. It's about deepening a relationship with somebody. There's many, many places on the continuum in relationships, and that it should feel good. Now, most parents nearly fall off their chairs when I say, I've told my children that sex should feel good. Actually, it should. And if it's not feeling good, there are reasons why it's not feeling good. Either you're not a good connection, there's not a good connection with this other person, or you're not telling them or asking them for what is good for you. And so we go back to where we started this conversation today about courageous communication and being able to have some very strong conversations with people, because it should feel good for both parties, and both parties need to be consenting. So our conversation gets to another level with our teenagers at this point. It may get to a point where you share with them, when you first had a sexual encounter, what age were you? Was it good for you? You don't have to go into all the gory details, but how did it impact on you emotionally? That's important for them. And yes, we'd really rather not know about this stuff and what's going on with our children. But it is important that we prepare our children for those encounters that they're going to have and those conversations that they're going to need to have. And those conversations might not be about saying yes. It might be having the courage to say, I'm not ready for this. I really like you, but I'm not ready for this. So I'm out of here. Are they able to have those conversations? Are they able to have that conversation with you saying, I've been in this relationship for 3 years now and it's progressing. Are they able to have that conversation with you?
And don't let your boundaries get in the way of having these conversations.
Yeah, your own uncomfortability might rise up and make you want to shut that conversation down. This is another one of those moments where, as parents, we need to manage that reaction in ourselves, and just be grateful, so grateful that your teen feels they can come and initiate a conversation like this with you. Really important that they have been honest with you about where they are, that they have investigated and sorted out things like birth control. They have to come and talk to you about this. They feel they're ready. It's going to happen. You need to be part of that conversation so that you can make sure they are as prepared and safe as they can possibly be in that instance. So take a breath, have a glass of wine, and have the conversation.
And I want to throw one last piece in here, and that is that your children will have better relationships and better sexual relationships if they know their own bodies. We have to break this taboo about touching your own body. And it's not just boys who touch their bodies and masturbate. Girls should be getting to know their own bodies too, because that is going to be empowering in their own relationships, sexual relationships with people one day, whether that is a sexual relationship at 16 or whether it's at 21, we don't know when it's going to be. But what we could wish for our children is that they know what feels good for them. And they know what their boundaries are too, so that they know what to say no to and what to say yes to. And yes, it's going to demand a lot of wine, I see in the chat. Parenting's not for sissies. It's really not for sissies. And I guess these conversations around sexuality all actually ultimately go back to source, is how do you feel about your own body? How do you feel about your own sexuality? Your children's conversations are going to challenge you. They're going to be the acid test for a lot about how you feel about life. What's going to happen? You have such clear ideas about abortion until it's your own child. You have such clear ideas about homosexuality until it's your own child. So you've got to be open to the fact that that very clear, sharp picture and expectation you have in your head may not actually be the way it turns out. So we've got to be a little more flexible, a little more adaptable, and go with that flow a little bit more, because your child is going to turn out the way your child turns out eventually. They're going to go and live their own life on their own terms eventually. And we have to make sure that we are on this roller coaster ride in the cart with our children and not laying on those tracks being run over by that cart. We want to be the ones riding with our children going, woo, woo, and not actually dying of fright and fearing every single second. And it really is the lens through which we view the world that is so important. Right. Before we close off, is there anything else that you'd like to add, Savannah and Lola?
I think my last say is just, this talking about things like abortion or homosexuality or all the other potentially contentious issues for me are a great gateway for you to use my favorite parenting sentence, which is, I don't know, what do you think? And I think that in our quest to be raising independent thinking individuals, inviting them during their teenage years to tell you what they think before you give your opinion is such a great way to begin to learn who this unique, wondrous creature is that is part of your family. So ask more and listen more, and happy parenting on the roller coaster.
So my last do for today is do remember your sense of humor, because at the end of the day, this is a crazy roller coaster, so best we make it fun.
Absolutely. So, yeah, I really like what you've just raised, Savannah. So whatever your children ask you, whether it's, how do I look in this dress? Or what do you think I should buy for my friend's birthday as a gift? Or do you think I'm ready for sex? You know, all of those questions you can respond with, I don't know. What do you think? And I think that is a very, very empowering statement to open up a conversation with your child, because so often we close the conversation with our opinion, because if they feel differently, they might not raise it once we have actually shared our own opinion. So that brings us to the end of this teen roller coaster session. We hope that we've opened the door to some deep thinking, that we've challenged some of your own perceptions about your teens and your own attitude towards your teens, and maybe that you're going to go out and have some courageous conversations with your young people. So thank you for joining us, and we hope that you have taken a lot of value from today. Thank you to Savannah, and thank you to Lola.